Hi, Vinny. Hi, Eli. Grandma has a book for Thanksgiving. It's called Meet the Pilgrim's Fathers. All right, here we go. By Elizabeth Payne, illustrated by H.B. Vestal. In the year 1606, a group of people called Separatists were living in Scrooby, England. On Sundays, the Separatists met secretly in each other's houses. They met to worship God. Their meetings were against the law. The law said Englishmen could meet to worship God only in King James churches. King James made all the religions rules of his churches. The Separatists would not obey the king's religious rules. They felt that they must live by the rules of the Bible. They chose their own church leader, and they met with him secretly. This made the king very angry. He said no one could have a church separate from his. He had the Separatist leader put in jail, but as soon as they were let out, the Separatists began to hold their meetings again. King James got angrier and angrier. He sent men to spy on the Separatists and break up their meetings. At last, the Separatists could stand it no longer. They decided to leave England and go to Holland. There was a law that no one could leave England without the king's permission. The Separatists knew the king would never give them permission to leave England, but that did not stop the Separatists. One by one, they sold their houses and farms. By twos and by threes, they went secretly to the seacoast. They hired boats. They sailed across the English Channel. By the end of 1608, about 125 Separatists had escaped to Holland. There was no king in Holland. In Holland, people could worship as they pleased. The Separatists in Holland. The Separatists were happy in Holland. No one spied on them. They were free to meet whenever they wanted. Most wonderful of all, they could have their own church. Sometimes the Separatists longed for the English farms they had sold. Sometimes they had worried that all they had to work hard for was little money. But their religion meant everything to them. It meant more than money. It meant more than living in England. It even meant more than having their children grow up to be more like Hollanders than Englishmen. The Separatists lived in Holland for 11 years. Then there was talk that Spain was going to declare war on Holland. The Separatists knew the King of Spain was a Catholic. If the Spanish king ruled Holland, the Separatists knew their church would be closed. A Separatist leader named William Brewster suggested they all leave Holland before the war came. But where could they go? All of Europe except Holland was ruled by kings with strong feelings about religion. William Brewster said he knew of a place where people might worship as they please. That place was called America. Separatists feared the very name of America. America was wild and a dangerous land. It belonged to the Indians. There was nothing there. There were no houses. There were no stores. There were no towns. There was one English town in America, Brewster said. It was called Jamestown. Jamestown had been built and settled by people who had been sent to America by English businessmen. The people in Jamestown had a hard time at first, but they had survived. Brewster was sure the Separatists could survive in America too, and perhaps they could even get some businessmen to send them there. Finally, about 100 Separatists said they would go to America if a way to get there could be found. They found some English businessmen who became their partners. The businessmen hired a ship called the Mayflower. They also brought some food and supplies that the Separatists would need in America. For their part, the Separatists agreed to work in America for 7 years. They would cut wood and get furs for the businessmen to sell in other parts of the world. After 7 years, the partners would divide the money that had been made. Then the Separatists would be free to work for themselves. When it came time to sign partnership papers, some of the Separatists changed their minds. Finally, the Separatists had to tell the businessmen that only 47 of them would go. Separatists John Carver and William Brewster were afraid of the businessmen would call off the trip. Both Brewster and Carver hurried to see the businessmen. But the businessmen had found 70 people who wanted to work in America. By twos and threes, these people were coming to Southampton, England, where the Mayflower was waiting to sail. Ooh, here we go. They're getting on the ship. Strangers on the Mayflower. Soon the Southampton dock was filled with people the businessman had found. Some, like William Mullins and James Billington, had brought their families. Others, like the young barrel maker John Alden, had come alone. These people were not going to America for religious reasons. Most of them were going because they could not find work in England. They brought the little that they owned with them. Many of them were sure they would never see England again. The Mayflower sailor made fun of the passengers. The passengers paid no attention. They were far too busy. They were carrying tools and cooking pans and bedding on the board. They were also trying to get a fishing boat onto the ship. At last, they sawed it into 4 pieces. Only then could they find room for it on the Mayflower. One of the Mayflower's passengers was trying to keep out of sight. He was the separatist leader, William Brewster. King James' men wanted to arrest him, so Brewster had to hide until the Mayflower had sailed. But it could not sail until the other separatists got to Southampton. Young William Bradford had written from Holland to say they were on their way. Days went by. Brewster hoped nothing had happened to Bradford and the other separatists. At last they arrived. Their trip had been rough. They had come to England on a small ship called Speedwell. It was much smaller than the Mayflower, but it was their very own. They had sold their homes to buy it. Bradford and some of the other separatists planned to sail the Speedwell across the sea right beside the Mayflower. Then they would have their own small ship in America. Chapter 4. Fall starts in a new land. The Speedwell tied up beside the Mayflower. The separatists were glad to see William Brewster and to find out he was safe. William Bradford was especially glad, for Brewster was like a father to him. All the separatists met Captain Christopher Jones of the Mayflower. Captain Jones introduced them to the other passengers who were going to America on his ship. The separatists learned that some of these passengers were going to America for adventure. One of the adventurers was a short man with bright red hair. His name was Miles Standish, and he was a soldier. He brought guns, gunpowder onto the Mayflower. He would use them to protect the settlers from Indians in America. The separatists made friends with Miles Standish and all the others. Everyone helped the separatists get the Speedwell ready to sail. Finally, their boat was ready. Twice the 2 ships started out. Twice they turned back because the Speedwell was leaking. At last it was decided the Speedwell could not be fixed. So this meant the settlers would not have their own little ship in America. It also meant everyone had to go on the Mayflower, but there was not room for 117 people on the Mayflower. Some were happy to stay behind. They said if all went well, they would come to America later. Farewell to the known. On the morning of September 6, 1620, a fine wind was blowing. There were 102 passengers crowded onto the Mayflower. Captain Jones called to his sailors. Up went the ship's sails. The Mayflower started out to sea. Now all the passengers had one thing in common. They were leaving their homes to go to a far-off land. In this way, they were all pilgrims. The pilgrims stood together on the ship deck. They watched the green hills of England slowly drop out of sight. Now the Mayflower was the only home for these 102 brave pilgrims. Soon the Mayflower was far out to sea. The pilgrims turned from the railings. They began to set their homes to rights. The women looked for places for their families to sleep. The only covered deck was very small. There was not enough bunks for everyone. The women put up as many hammocks as they could, but they made beds on the floor for the rest of the people. The children explored the ship. They were been told to stay out of the sailors' way. Most of them did, but not the Billington boys. Little Francis and John Billington got into everyone's way. So look there, looks like they're getting into their way. It was not easy to get away from the Billington boys. The Mayflower was so crowded that no one had a quiet place of his own. This did not stop the separatist pilgrims from having their church meetings. They said their prayers and sang. Often the sailors made fun of these meetings. But even so, the separatist pilgrims met with William Brewster and prayed every morning during the trip. Troubles at sea. Many of the Pilgrims had never gone so far out to sea before. The rolling of the boat made many of them sick. So did some of the food. The women had to cook out on the open deck. They could not cook every day. Sometimes the wind blew too hard. Captain Jones was afraid the women's fires might spread and burn up his ship. So on windy days, the Pilgrims had nothing to eat but cold, dry food. For a month, the Mayflower had good weather. By early October, they were halfway across the sea. Then the ship ran into a storm. Great waves began to crash over the deck. The captain ordered the sails taken down. He sent all the Pilgrims to the covered deck. The Mayflower was tossed through this way and that. Water ran through the ship. It soaked the Pilgrims' beds. It soaked their food. It soaked their clothes. The Pilgrims were ice cold and wet to the skin. Many were sick. Many were afraid. The ship creaked and cracked. The Pilgrims were sure the Mayflower was going to break into two. The Pilgrims huddled together on the covered deck. One day, John Holland could stand no more. He said he had to have some fresh air. John climbed up on the open deck. A great wave rolled the ship to one side. John could not hold on. He fell into the sea. There he is. A rope was hanging over the side of the ship. John grabbed it. He hung on. The sailors pulled him back onto the board. The Scepters gave thanks to God that John's life had been saved. A few days later, they gave thanks again as the storm roared outside. Mrs. Stephen Hopkins gave birth to a fine baby boy. She named her son Oceanus because he had been born far out in the Atlantic Ocean. The ship was in storms most of October. Then the sun came out. The sea grew quiet. The Pilgrims could come up on the open deck again. The cold, fresh November air smelled wonderful to them, but the Pilgrims were thin and weak. They had been at sea for more than 2 months. They longed for the sight of land. Just a few days later, one of the sailors cried out. He said that he saw Cape Cod ahead. The Pilgrims ran to the Mayflower's railing. In the early morning light, they saw a white sand beach. They saw woods and bushes. They saw America. Captain Jones said that Cape Cod was a long arm of the land. It curved out into the sea from the part of America called New England. The captain said English fishermen and explorers had been to this part of America, but no English people had ever tried to live here. Except for Indians, Captain Jones said the Pilgrims would have Cape Cod to themselves. I think this would be a good part, and we will read the rest tomorrow on Thanksgiving. I love you. Mwah!